We'll jump into the power meter issue because lots of people are still on the fence about even just getting a power meter. So let's start with that issue. Why is getting a power meter so vital?
It's good that you mentioned that, we are really across using running watches and possibly using a watch in the pool, and that's just common. And majority of people are quite across that. You would say over 90% of the people do use that functionality. Some people just still run without a watch, but they're in the minority. Whereas the power meter, the minority is the people with the power meter. And then the next minority is the people who know how to use it.
Yeah, because there are a lot of people that have power meters but don't know how to use it.
That's right. So majority of people are still riding, and this is absolutely fine. We're not saying this is right or wrong. It's just that you're missing out on valuable assets that will help you train and race better to get yourself a personal best is what we're trying to achieve here. So
I would go as far as saying it is wrong to go without a power meter.
It is, but it's certainly, it's a disadvantage if you don't have it. But so we're wanting people to get as familiar with power as they are with their running watch. That's our goal, and we're providing this opportunity to teach you to do this in this clinic. And make it as simple as possible. And the power meter is measuring each pedal stroke that you're doing, and it comes up as a number on your screen. And that's as simple as I can make it. So every time you pedal, it'll measure the output from a number that the input is of your action of pedaling. And it's a measurable piece of data.
Yeah. So basically there's two main types of power meters. You can get pedal-based power meters or crank-based power meters, and they go either on the pedal or the crank of your bike, and they measure the wattage that you're pushing through the pedals. And then that wattage is linked to your bike computer. Most people have a Garmin. So let's say, for example's sake, it is linked to your Garmin. As you said, the wattage that you're pushing with each pedal stroke appears on your Garmin. Right.
That's right. Yeah. And just like I suppose as an electrician, the ampage that goes through the power lines to make the light bulb go is the effort we're putting in each pedal stroke. That's and it's measured in watts.
Yeah. So the first common objection to power meters is the cost, obviously, because it's an extra, $500 to maybe $1,000 for a pretty standard power meter. And that is just often a cost that is a barrier to entry. People go, I already spend so much on my bike and everything, and the sport of triathlon is expensive. Do I really need to spend this extra money on a power meter? And we're hoping with today's discussion we can convince you that it is an absolute no-brainer. The advantages you get far outweigh the disadvantages of saving $500 to $1,000.
Yeah, not having key information. For example, we joked about this before. It was like jumping in the car and not having the speedo work on your car or the fuel gauge. And so you're getting in the car and you don't know what speed you're driving at, and you could possibly get pulled over and fined because you don't have any data coming back to you saying you're doing 60 in a 40 zone or 100 in a 80 zone, and you've got no idea how much fuel's left in the tank. So you could actually have 5 kilometers left of fuel in the tank. So that's how important having a power meter is, we feel, to your race training strategies. And without those pieces of equipment, you are pretty much driving the car blindfold. You're training blindfold. That's how important
you wouldn't drive a car, would you? If you got in and it had no speedo and had no fuel gauge, you wouldn't drive it. It's too risky.
Yeah. And so we're still astounded that people go into races and do a whole program that culminates in a race without basically understanding that the power meter is there and they could use it and they could be a better athlete because of it. So that's what we're trying to get across here is it is a tool. It's very necessary, and on this clinic training day, we will show you exactly how to use it, how to test it, and how to race with it.
So let's give a training example, because we spoke before about how you are potentially wasting all your training sessions that you're doing, all that hard work you're putting in. You're potentially wasting those sessions because they're not as valuable as they could be because you're not sticking to the right numbers and you're not using the power meter properly. And we had an example recently. We had a new athlete start with us, and they are, to be honest, a very good athlete. They are very highly trained, very talented, a really good athlete, but they hadn't had experience with power. So they were starting with power for the first time. And like we said at the start, it's no problem whether you're a beginner or an advanced athlete. If you've never used it before, then you're not going to know what to do. So they did their first bike session with power. And it actually turned into a bit of a funny experiment for us because they were still learning and they didn't know how to read the power properly, which is another issue we'll get into in a little bit. But they had the power meter set up. They got their power meter on their bike. They had it set up. It was showing the wattage on their screen, but they weren't looking at the right things on the screen. And so they were basically doing the session like they normally would, but we had the advantage of we could see their data after they completed the session. So it actually coincidentally turned into a little bit of an experiment similar to what you were saying before. You'd have loved in your pro days to have someone that could have shown you your data, even though you thought that you were riding well to feel or running well to feel. You wonder if the data would say differently. And in this case, the data absolutely said differently. So the athlete did their session as best they could. They were doing, I think it was 4 5-minute efforts on the bike, and they were supposed to hit something around 240 or 245 watts. And I can't remember the exact numbers, but basically their first effort, they were at over 260 watts. The second one, they were about at the range at 245 watts. The third one, they were at 220 watts. And the last one, they're at 210 watts. And so they were supposed to be around 240 to 245 for the 4 efforts. Because they were riding blind, they were just going as hard as they could and seeing what happened. And they went way too hard at the first one. They actually, according to our standards, failed the session on the 3rd and 4th rep because they weren't hitting the power range they were supposed to. And they were riding blind. They didn't know that this data was basically being recorded. And so looking back on the session, that shows clearly how when you are training to feel, you might finish the session and think, oh, I worked as hard as I could then. I did that session really well. But the data tells you differently. The data says actually your 3rd and 4th rep weren't where they needed to be and you missed the value of that session. If you hadn't have gone so hard in the first one, if they knew they were going way over what they needed to and they were going over 260 watts, they could have pulled it back, which meant they could have done the 3rd and 4th rep properly. But instead they were too gassed and the session was a failure. And for this athlete, they're a really good athlete. They might have been training this way their whole life. And thinking that they were always doing really good sessions. And they were. Any session where you go that hard is going to be somewhat valuable, but they were missing key gains where they could have been getting way more out of the 3rd and 4th rep. And to me, that clear example just shows how valuable this is and how much you're missing out on training and racing benefits without looking at the numbers properly.
Yeah, there's so much in what you've just described, and the response from the athlete is when they were shown how far away from the range that they were supposed to be riding in was, I just can't believe I was so far. I felt that just as hard. I was going just as hard as I should have been. And I can't believe I was literally 60 watts difference from first to last effort. And how that session didn't get the goal and outcome, which was, 4 times 240 watts. Instead, they got 1 at 260 and 2 below 220. And so therefore, they've really wasted that session. They've done a training session, which is
They've worked
fine.
hard. Yeah.
Tick. They've worked hard. They've worked to feel hard. But when you analyse the data, they've actually not achieved the goal, which is doing those 4 sessions at the right power. And it's like having the coach riding beside you, because instead of me checking all the time saying, come on, go faster, Jordan, go faster, you're slowing down. Whereas if you're just riding to feel, you don't have that coach doing that. You're just going to have feels. And that's what having a power meter is. It's like having the coach. You look down and the number you're supposed to be riding is 240, and look down and you see you're averaging 220. You go, holy shit, I need to actually ride a bit harder. And I know I can ride harder because these are my numbers. Mm-hmm. And I should be in that range. And all of a sudden, you start hitting targets for every training session, and you start to become a better bike rider. Yeah. Because you are actually getting the benefit of the actual training session of 4 efforts, not 1.5 efforts in the right zone.
And that's the key here, isn't it? If we had 2 athletes, we put them side by side, and they were the same ability, and athlete A did the session like the example we just said, and every session they were doing 1.5 efforts correct, but 2.5 wrong. And athlete B did every effort to what they were supposed to. You think every single session, athlete B is getting slightly better than athlete A because they're just getting a little bit more out of the session. You do that for 6 to 12 months. How much further ahead is athlete B going to be?
Yeah, the consistency factor can't be underestimated too. And so if you're doing each session consistently correct and not just guessing that you did it well, but actually reviewing and knowing during the session that you're in the right range, there's a lot of things in there, isn't there? There's knowing you're in the range already in the middle of the session, and then get to the end of the session and knowing that you actually have completed the 6 efforts or 4 efforts or whatever the session's asking you to do in the right range, then you walk away from that session pretty happy with yourself without even discussing it with anybody, because the data has told you that you achieved the outcome. And and you will improve way faster than the person who's doing the by feel.